And then the last really important one is drainage and soil type. Many of our Waterwise or California native plants want well-drained soil. If you don't have well-drained soil, if you have mostly around here, it's clay soil types that are the ones that are not well-drained. If you don't have well-drained soil, that's fine. There are plenty of Waterwise and especially California native plants that are naturally adapted to growing in clay soils, but you really want to know what you're dealing with in terms of your soil drainage characteristics. So then you can select and purchase your plants appropriately and select things that are going to thrive. The reality is you are never going to change your soil type. You might read on the internet, some people, will say mix sand, mix perlite into soil. It's really pretty much impossible to do that and be successful. Especially if you're mixing into like soil in the ground, large yard area, really adding like sand to clay soil is just going to pack things tighter and make it more like concrete. If you're just dealing with one or two planters or raised beds, you could, if you're really devoted to it, you could really maybe mix in a whole bunch of perlite. To me, that'd be so much work. And there's plenty of plants that are great plants that will grow well in that soil anyways, so you might as well stick with that. But the big question is, how do you know? So to know what kind of soil type you have is going to be a little bit more than we get into today. There's plenty of good information online about it. One common way that people will do it is something called a jar soil type test, and there's plenty of instructions online about how to do that. The most basic thing is if your soil is wet and you kind of squish it in between your fingers and rub your fingers together, if it feels grittier, it's probably going to be a sandy soil type. If it gets very slick and very muddy, it's probably going to be a clay soil type. But at the end of the day, the reason why it matters the most is for drainage. Sometimes people will have a sandy soil type, but because of heavy equipment in the past, or someone used to park a truck in that area, it's very compact. And what I've found over the years is that in those situations, the plants that are going to thrive with that compaction, because there's not that much drainage to it, are the same plants that thrive in clay soil. So really what I focus on, and the thing that's really easier to test for people at home, is to focus on your drainage. And it's pretty easy to conduct a few basic drainage tests in the area that you're thinking about planting. And so basically you're going to dig a 1 foot deep and 1 foot wide hole, fill that hole with a hose and let the water absorb, and then do it again. Those first 2 times, you're just filling that hole and letting the water absorb, because you want to make sure that the soil under and all around that hole is saturated with water. Understanding a drainage rate, really the drainage rate is once it's been raining for days, once that soil is wet, how fast can the water move down through that soil profile due to the force of gravity being exerted on that saturated soil? And the different physical and chemical characteristics of the soil will be responsible for the different parts. But if your soil is dry under and around that hole, you're going to get a very different outcome, which could show higher drainage or could show lower drainage in certain circumstances. And so you really need to make sure that you fill and let that hole drain out a couple of times. That first part could take all day, and then you can do the actual test, the timing of that the next day. So dig that hole, fill it with the hose, let the water absorb, do it again. Then the third time you fill that hole, you're going to start a timer. And what you're going to want to do is measure how many new inches of water have drained out at the end of each hour. And you can do it whatever way works best for you. But the easiest thing to do is do it on a day when you're going to be home. Just set an alarm on your phone or something, and every hour go out and take a measurement. That's going to definitely be the simplest and give you the best, most accurate information. And that will give you an idea of your soil's average infiltration rate. So we'll show a quick test. So this is a hole in a lawn area. This is Covina, California, where one of my coworkers lives. And he suspected that his soil was kind of clay. And so he did the drainage test, and this is the hole. You see this stick across here. Stick, a broom handle, anything that's kind of flat and can go across this, a yardstick if you have one, is going to be very useful, because then when it comes to taking your measurement, it gives you a really solid flat surface to take that measurement across. It becomes really hard to eyeball where exactly the top of the soil is if you don't have something across the top of that hole. And this really gives you an accurate, kind of consistent measurement. Make sure that you're going to be looking at it at the same angle each time you come in. And if you have a lot of thatch or turf or mulch or whatever, make sure that you push enough off to the side and really get this flat part in towards the top of the hole. So here we go. After 1 hour, 3 inches of drainage, pretty good. But you need to keep coming back hour after hour, because as you can see here, hour 2, only 1 additional inch of drainage. So it was 3 inches after 1 hour, 4 inches after 2 hours. So you're just calculating how many new inches. And this is pretty common for over time, the infiltration rate to go down as it's draining out. Sometimes it can go back up a little bit. So hour 3, 1 1/4, hour 4, 3/4 of an inch, hour 5, just 1/4 of an inch, hour 6, 3/4 of an inch. And so this is pretty typical for a heavy clay soil type. And so what you can see from here is that, on average, especially after that first hour, we're looking at round about 1 inch per hour, maybe less. That's definitely clay or slow draining soil. And so here's kind of the key when you figure that out. If your soil, when you do this test, drains 2 inches per hour or more, congratulations, you have well-drained soil. That's ideal, becomes very flexible for what you can grow. If you have like 5 inches, 6 inches, the whole thing drains out in an hour, that's going to be very well-drained soil, and you will be definitely better off growing Waterwise or California native drought-adapted material. 1 to 2 inches per hour I consider kind of medium infiltration. Not the worst. In 1 to 2 inches per hour draining landscapes that I've planted, sometimes I will plant the whole kind of range of material that needs well-drained soil, and everything will do just fine. But I've also had landscapes where I've in that zone and I plant that range, and then if we have a kind of big series of winter storms, not like anything we've had here in Southern California yet this year, but kind of back-to-back storms, that some of the plants that do want well-drained soil really suffer. And eventually I've had to change that landscape over to focusing on things that are better at dealing with slower draining soil. So my general recommendation, if you're wanting to play it safe and not really experiment much when you're in a landscape that's 1 to 2 inches per hour, would be focused mostly on plants that are adapted to clay or slower draining soil. And then if you have some plants that you really want to grow that need better drained soil, maybe have some mounds or some subtly like raised beds. If it's a naturalistic landscape, you can use river rock or things, but some ways of getting a little bit of higher topography into that landscape. If you're digging out something like a dry stream bed to capture and infiltrate water, which I always encourage, then you'll have some extra soil, and you can build some mounds and make sure the root balls of that plant, of those plants that want that better drained soil, are elevated a little bit, and that can really help you out for kind of overall success. But if you have 1 inch per hour of drainage or less, slow draining soil, you're going to want to stick to plants that are adapted to clay or slow draining soil. We'll talk about how to find that out a little bit later on, but not the end of the world. And sometimes it makes your choices even a little bit easier, because there's so many different plants you can grow, and so many great plants that grow in clay or slower draining soil, that's just a filter right off the top.